all the exams on HaskCT. I posted the exams of the last 3 years. So there is quiz as well. So I would use them as a study guide as well. Don't use them just to practice as a test. Instead, use them to test whether or not you think you understand the material or not. As you can imagine, by having 3 years exams, I'm not going to be the most creative. So the style of the questions will be very similar. So that should give you a very good base to figure out what type of questions I plan to ask. Also, next week, the day before the exam, I will set up a review session with the lecture TA. So as soon as I find a room and a time, I will let you know. So you're welcome to go to that. Matt took the class 2 years ago and used to do this for a while. So he's very familiar with the material. So it will be a good resource to ask questions. So I'm going to move on today's lecture, but before that I want to review a couple of the main concepts I went through last night. So what I mentioned before is that the way skeletal muscles, the initiation of contraction skeletal muscles starts from having a motor neuron releasing acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. Skeletal muscle activation requires that step. In the other types of muscles, acetylcholine release is not a requirement. But in the case of skeletal muscle, you need to have acetylcholine release to bind to postsynaptic receptors, which will then open, allowing sodium to move in, polarizing this membrane, and then allowing the membrane to reach the threshold for an action potential, which then will propagate down the tubules and activate these L-type calcium channels, who in reality they don't conduct calcium, but instead, when they do activate, they are opening random receptors, which are found as cytoplasmic pigment. When that happens, calcium enters the cytoplasm, which initiates the myosin, allowing cross-bridge to take place, and then you get the contraction, which is shown here. So those are the main steps, and I will highlight some of them as we go through some disorders, just highlight some of the properties of those, and what happens when certain elements of all these processes become effective. Two, I also want to remind them, because as I talk about the smooth muscle and the cardiac muscle, there are some distinct differences between them into how contraction gets initiated in different tissues. In the case of smooth muscle, the whole cascade of events is fundamentally different. And then I want you to remember it. Now, we talk about calcium entering, but how does calcium leave? So, in order to have muscle relaxation for skeletal muscle, calcium levels have to drop. And there are multiple ways in which the calcium is going to drop into the skeletal muscle. First, you need to stop the conduction. So you need to have, so I'm talking about here how the muscle relaxes. So it's after the closure of those receptors. And what's happening now is when the hyperemesis takes place, the calcium channels on the tubules shut down, now plunging closed around the receptors. So the first thing to have is those receptors to be closed. But then all this calcium is going to have to go somewhere. One of the major sources of removal is a calcium ATPase for the cytoplasmic reticulum. It's otherwise known as SERCA, S-E-R-C-A. It's by far the major place of calcium reuptake. And you also need that because this is where calcium comes from. So you need to replenish your stores. So by replenishing the stores, the muscle now is able to, the next time there is a contraction signal, to initiate a release of calcium. Calcium also activates mitochondria for oxidative phosphorylation. At the same time, calcium can enter the mitochondria. So mitochondria can also act as a place for calcium reuptake, so calcium buffer. But the major source is going to be cytoplasmic reticulum. That's by far the most dominant aspect. Now, the thing I want to point out is that when you have the calcium, one thing you're always going to create is because of all this activity, you're going to create heat. This heat is not because of hydrolysis of only of ATP for the Martian active Martian cycle, it's also because of the pump. If you notice, this is a primary pump, so it requires ATP in order to take calcium from inside the cytosol and bring it into the cytoplasm quickly. So therefore, ATP during the contraction cycle has multiple functions, one of which is to allow to stimulate the calcium uptake into the cytoplasm. So you have quite a bit of ATP hydrolyzed. As a result, you have quite a bit of heat generated, and depending on other energy sources, you may have lactate, which creates pain. Now, by knowing the molecular components of this process, over the years, drugs have been designed or identified that can manipulate fairly well. And if anybody has a surgery, for instance, one part of the general anesthesia component is also to give them muscle relaxants. The muscle relaxants are sometimes necessary to relax the trachea, to do intubations, and what I have here is a mention of a few of them, from the shortest lasting to the most lasting. This is tributylin, which actually is a poison. It was identified in South America. Native indigenous people there use it to put it on their arrows, and that allowed them to kill the prey, because when tributylin enters the system, what it does, it binds to acetylcholine receptors, prevent them to be activated. As a result, you get paralysis. And that's true for all the other muscle relaxants. So those are kind of analogs of acetylcholine. They're more stable, and some are very short-lasting, like this one. Other ones are more long-lasting. Pacuronium is also popular within the correctional facilities. This is actually the second drug for lethal injections. So the reason is they give that to relax the diaphragm. So it's part of the process. By creating paralysis, the idea is the muscles are more relaxed, and it's going to be easier to give the third regimen, which is potassium chloride. However, there's another, so there are two classes. One is that they inhibit the channels, and there's another compound called succinylcholine. In these cases, what this drug does, it actually binds and opens the receptor. And this may sound counterintuitive, because if you want to induce paralysis, how do you do that? By opening the channel. And the reason that works is the following. Nicotine receptors and acetylcholine receptors have a property. If there is a prolonged activation, they shut down. So they can call it desensitization. So they desensitize to their stimulus. If you were to look at the time course of acetylcholine in the cleft, it's very, very brief, like a millisecond to 5 milliseconds. Extremely brief time. If it stays for longer time, the channel desensitizes. So this drugs is taking advantage of that. So you put in low concentrations of it, and then at this, we activate the receptor slightly, and then move them to desensitization, so the receptor shuts down. And that's why it's called depolarizing blocker, because it actually induces an initial depolarization. So you don't activate it a bit, and then it shuts down. So those are the two major classes, and the combination of them are used in the clinics. But the main thing I want to highlight is that because we know what receptor we have, we know how the skeletal muscle works, you can go and design different drugs that will shut down different things. Also, toxins have been extremely powerful in understanding the skeletal muscle properties. So one of them, the most famous one, is called alpha-bungarotoxin. So alpha-bungarotoxin comes from the skate snake that's found in Taiwan, and is an extremely high affinity toxin for nicotine acetylcholine receptors. It binds to them almost irreversibly. It means that it will take forever to ever wash it out. And what you see on the right is actually, this is going to be the muscle. You don't see the muscle because it's in black. However, what you see in yellow are motor units and motor neurons going down the muscle. And what you see in red are actually the nicotinic receptors. You can take this toxin, put it on with a fluorescent molecule, and then bath apply it into your specimen, and then you do fixation, and then using confocal microscopy, you can visualize, and allows you to really see how these receptors are arranged within the muscle, and you can actually really probe how they look inside. So this is how actually, that's the arrangement of the motor neurons and the nicotine acetylcholine receptors into the neuromuscular junction. Now, over the years, we have also recognized that there are multiple neuromuscular disorders. And I'm giving you a list of a few of them. I don't expect you to know details about them. I'll just mention a few of them, and I'll make comments for some of them. You have myasthenia gravis, which I'll give you actually some information in the next slide. And you have what's called myasthenic syndrome, which is similar to myasthenia gravis, but the mechanism is quite distinct, but the phenotype is very similar. The observations are very similar. Then you have muscular dystrophies, which are pretty much these disorders that cause neurodegeneration of the muscle. You have myotonias, which causes prolonged contractions. In this case, you get the exact opposite, where with muscular dystrophies, you're getting paralysis and weakness of the muscle. With myotonias, you get more stimulation. You have multiple sclerosis, and you have Guillain-Barré syndrome as well as ALS. ALS in the States is also known as Lou Gehrig disease, which is pretty much your motor units, the motor neurons actually decompose. However, let me give you examples of a few of them. So myasthenia gravis, it's a disorder in which with prolonged exercise you see a weakness of the muscle. And one of the classical characteristics and diagnosis for this is about your eyelids. So if you force somebody who has myasthenia gravis to look up, force them to keep their eyelids open, what you're finding is they cannot really do it for quite a bit of time. The reason being is, as they start doing it, their muscles get really weak and the eyelids start drooping down. Now, the mechanism for that is that you're losing acetylcholine receptors. So what's happening in this case is the acetylcholine receptors are really not functional. So the disease is really made by these receptors here are start shutting down, they don't exist anymore, and as a result, you can't initiate the contraction. The way to treat this is the following. I mentioned that acetylcholine is diffused in the cleft, but the way it gets eliminated is by an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase is an enzyme that's found at the sides of those junctions, and its function is to break down acetylcholine. So the best treatment for it is to apply a drug that inhibits acetylcholine esterase. As a result, you prolong the time acetylcholine in the cleft, allowing to activate the fewer remaining receptors. So allowing a couple of more cycles of activation of the few receptors that are left, allowing the patient to recover and allow them to maintain their muscle. A similar disorder called myasthenic syndrome, but here the difference is that the effect is on the calcium channels on the presynaptic terminal. So I mentioned that in order to activate acetylcholine, in order for the vesicles to fuse the terminal, the calcium channels have to open, allowing calcium to enter the terminal. In this case of disorder, those channels are defective. Therefore, there's very less calcium entering, and you have less release of acetylcholine. Now, the problem with that is you can't, using acetylcholesterol is not going to help you much because you don't have any acetylcholine being released. It's already limited. So even though you put the acetylcholesterol to prolong it, it's not enough to build up enough acetylcholine to do it. Improves with exercise. The reason is more of a biophysical property of a calcium release mechanism. Typically, when you have any calcium-induced mechanism, sometimes if you prolong the stimulation, you can build up more calcium, cause more release. And because exercise causes higher demand of contractions, you can build up enough calcium to get some extra release. But overall, the main defect is on the presynaptic side, and it's going to be here. So in the case of myasthenia gravis, it's on the postsynaptic side, so you don't have receptors to work. In the case of myasthenic syndrome, you lost the presynaptic calcium channels, so you don't have the vesicles to release. As far as the patients are concerned, the effect is kind of similar. You have a weakening of your muscles. So you can create that either way. One other thing I want to point out is the following. It's kind of a unique, it's actually the therapy of it is fairly unique. This is taken from Mayo Clinic's website.
The symptoms came on fast. Within weeks, the woman you're about to meet went from being completely healthy to lying in the intensive care unit, unable to move, struggling to breathe, a victim of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Listen to her story of sickness and triumph. Cooking breakfast is a simple task, but to Beth DeVries, it's much more.
I couldn't even hold the egg, let alone crack it.
You see, Beth survived 2 episodes of recurrent Guillain-Barré syndrome. Symptoms started in her feet.
It's like I couldn't feel the floor.
Numbness and weakness progressed quickly throughout her body.
But I walked into the kitchen, and I fell on the floor, flat on my face, and I couldn't get up. I couldn't move.
Beth ended up in the intensive care unit.
I said goodbye to my parents 3 times. I didn't think I was going to make it through the night.
Father and son team doctors Peter and James Dick study Guillain-Barré syndrome and related illnesses. They say the disease usually happens after a viral infection.
And so your immune system gets confused. And so instead of attacking the virus, it attacks your own nerves. And usually what happens is it causes demyelination. Myelin is insulation around nerve fibers.
It helps nerves conduct signals. If your immune system attacks nerves, the insulation breaks down. Nerves don't conduct as fast as normal, or they don't conduct at all. Muscles become weak or simply don't work. Guillain-Barré syndrome is very scary, but most patients like Beth do recover. Treatment involves what's called plasmapheresis, during which blood is washed and returned to the body. Patients may also have infusions of immunoglobulin. Both prevent the immune system from attacking nerves. After more than a year in the hospital and many months of recovery, Beth is almost back to normal, able to live the life that was briefly taken away from her.
The thing I want to get out of this is that actually multiple disorders for the head, when it comes to neurovascular junction, are autoimmune. So pretty much the have an immune response that goes and either affects acetylcholine receptors, or in this case, seems to affect the myelin. The treatment here is fairly unique, in which they pretty much have to filter the blood. That's what we talk about it. Pretty much taking the blood away from the person, they put it through a filter. The idea is removing those antibodies that are targeting myelin, and as a result, after you clean them up, the myelin can be made, because myelin is constantly generated. So you can actually, as long as you have the cells to make myelin, you can generate it. And so, so you can have muscle weakness by affecting different things. So, postsynaptic receptors, presynaptic calcium channels, or myelin. So you may have a normal neuromuscular junction, but if the signal is not propagated, you will get effects. So that's really the main idea I want to get out of it, that there's multiple ways to release the same effect, and as a result, it makes it quite challenging to figure out what exactly is happening, because when a patient goes to the medical doctor, a lot of times they complain for muscle weakness, but muscle weakness can be for many, many reasons. So I'm going to finish up this lecture on smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, and then I will move on to the actual lecture for today, which is going to be about different muscle disorders. So smooth muscle is kind of unique from the skeletal muscle, in which it has only one nucleus. The cells are flattened and elongated, and also they have no striations. You don't really see this nice stretch that you see in both skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And you don't find, and what they're really made up is what's called dense bodies. So you see throughout the smooth muscle, these dense bodies, and this is where the actin and myosin filaments are attached to it. And the dense bones will be, think about them as the pillars in which contraction is going to be taking place, but they're the ones that the stable forces, that's going to be the place where the attachment takes place. The main other effect about smooth muscle is you find in surrounding the organs and all the blood vessels. You're not going to find a skeletal muscle surrounding the uterus or the blood vessels. It's all going to be smooth muscle. And I mentioned last time, but the properties of the smooth muscle are fairly diverse. And as a result, I will talk about the contraction mechanisms, and I'll highlight what is always constant and what really changes from smooth muscle to smooth muscle. It's a fairly diverse and modular muscle, allowing some of the properties to change to fit the function that they have. And the main thing, of course, is under involuntary control. Unlike the skeletal muscles, which would can't control, we really can't control ourselves, the smooth muscle contractions. The contraction that takes place in smooth muscle is also a little different. Instead of having, like a skeletal muscle, just having a uniform contraction, here you have a contraction, but if you notice, it becomes like it's just a ball in which you have strings attached to it. So it's like having strings around the smooth muscle and just stretching the strings, creating it into like a ball. So it creates contraction, but it's really changed the shape completely. It's very, very unique to see how it takes place. And the reason for that is the arrangement of having these bodies and how the active myosin filaments are arranged. One thing I want to highlight is that the way, here's a thick myosin filaments, and if you notice what you have is you have two rows of myosin heads that go the exact opposite direction. So in one case, it goes left to right, the other case it goes right to left. This is what really makes it to really contract the way it does. If you remember in the case of skeletal muscle, all the head groups of myosin are facing the same direction. So it's a completely one parallel row. Well, here you have two completely anti-parallel. So it allows, by having that, it allows to have this massive contraction. But besides that, there is also quite a bit of difference in how activation takes place in contraction. So your physiology books talks about that calcium has to enter from the outside. When calcium enters from the outside, causes some calcium release from cytoplasmic reticulum. However, in the smooth muscle, you don't have tubules, and the cytoplasmic reticulum is actually not as enhanced as the skeletal muscle. It's much smaller. But calcium now enters from the outside, causing more calcium release. But this influx of calcium binds to a protein called calmodulin. Calmodulin is a cytosolic protein. It will find calcium and bind to it. When calcium has bound calmodulin, it will then go and bind to an enzyme called myosin light chain kinase. The function of this enzyme is to actually add a phosphate group to myosin. So what happens here is calcium comes in, binds to calmodulin. Calmodulin will then bind to the inactive enzyme called MLCK. Then it will activate. The active myosin light chain kinase will go and phosphorylate, which means it will go and add a phosphate group to myosin. When that takes place, myosin can now go and bind to thin filaments and allow the active myosin cycle to take place. And as a result, you're going to get the contractions. Now, a couple of things. In skeletal muscles, calcium binds to troponin, which is at the thin filaments. So the thin filaments is where the calcium has to bind to. In the case of smooth muscle, all the signaling takes place through the thick filaments. So calcium calmodulated myosin light chain kinase, they have to activate the myosin molecules, which are the thick filaments. So that's one distinction. The other distinction is it's a complete it's quite a complex cascade of events. It's not just calcium binds to troponin causing tropomyosin to move away, and the cycle takes place. Here you need to have multiple steps in which requires phosphorylation. Phosphorylation means just adding a phosphate to a particular site in the protein. Now the other thing is that besides using the ATP to create the active myosin cycle, you also now need ATP to create phosphorylation event. So the switch for myosin to take place will also require ATP. So the ATP is going to be used to add phosphate into myosin. So in this case, you add another step in which ATP has to be involved. So it's not just active myosin cycle, ATP now has to be hydrolyzed in order to activate myosin. And that's in concert with calcium. So you need both two events to take place in order for the contraction to take place. Now, because you have this myosin light chain kinase and phosphorylation, what's happening is you get delays in the activation of the process. So the actual contraction of the smooth muscle is much longer. But the other thing is the contraction is longer lasting because it takes time to lose this phosphate. And actually the way the muscle here has to relax is, again, it's a multi-step process. When calcium shuts down, there's no more calcium influx, then calcium has to be excluded in two different ways. Calcium goes pumped back into the cytoplasmic reticulum, or is being pumped out of the cell through a sodium calcium exchanger. After calcium has been decreased, calcium will then unbind, so it will leave calmodulin. And when that happens, calmodulin will leave mast cell light chain kinase, and it will be inactive. However, even though you have an inactive mast cell light chain kinase, you still have myosin to be phosphorylated. So in order to lose this phosphate from myosin, another enzyme has to come in, called myosin phosphatase. Myosin phosphatase function is actually to remove that phosphate, stopping the cycle. So both the activation process is a multi-step process with a lot of delays. Also the relaxation requires a lot of steps, which also creates delays. As a result, because of also the myosin has a longer lasting, it's a slower myosin than skeletal muscle, the whole cycle takes longer, you end up having a much more prolonged contraction of smooth muscle. You can generate quite a bit of force, but it's going to be a much longer contraction. The benefit also of having a longer lasting myosin cycle is you need less ATP in the whole process. So, and that's important because in this case, ATP is used in multiple things. It's used to phosphorylate the myosin, so you already expend quite a bit of ATP for that, so you really want to preserve as much as possible. Any questions about this process? Would you like me to repeat? So cardiac muscle. Unlike the smooth muscle, it's very more similar to skeletal muscle. It's striated, so it has striations. Therefore, you have the sarcomeres, and you have the exact arrangement of the contractile elements. You can have only one or two nuclei, and you have what's called a Y-shaped branches, so it looks like a Y. But the key here is that it has intercalated discs, which are the gap junctions allowing the neighboring muscle fibers to really communicate with each other. They're also what's called autorhythmic. So you really don't need to generate a signal from the nervous system. So the nervous system doesn't need to send a signal into the cardiac cell saying it's time for it to contract. They can actually generate their own contraction, their autorhythmic abilities. And again, they're under involuntary control. Most of us cannot control the heart rate, although there are cases of some people who claim they do. The vast majority of us don't have that type of control. The differences is striated. It has a sarcomere structure. However, they're much shorter as in the fibers, the cells. They can be branched and have a single nucleus, but like smooth, they can be electrically linked. So the smooth muscles, I mentioned they're diverse. So some of them are electrically linked gap junctions, some they're not. Your Sinopharm book is using it as a fact that this is always the case. The answer is not always the case. Some smooth muscles will be electrically coupled, some may not be. But because they could be, you could say the cardiac muscles are very similar to smooth muscles from that point of view. Although the smooth muscles don't have this intercalated disc, you don't see this type of clear break between the two cell types. It's very difficult to distinguish that in muscle fibers. So you can see here the Y-shaped, the one nucleus. And again, the function of the gap junction is to allow synchrony, allows you to really, for the whole muscles to start contracting together. So you need to synchronize it, and it's best to do it if the muscle fibers communicate with each other. And because gap junctions are fairly big ion channels, depolarization can quickly move through them. So the charge movement from one cell to the other cell can really propagate fairly quickly. Now, this is a comparison of the time course of tension that you generate in the different muscles. And you can see here, we get in the tension you develop, skeletal muscle is the quickest, it's much faster. The cardiac muscle takes the longer, and the smooth muscle is the longest. Now, the reason the cardiac muscle and the skeletal muscle are different is because if you remember from the action potentials, the cardiac muscle action potential has a plateau phase, has a much longer calcium efflux. As a result, you're getting calcium for a longer period of time in the cardiac muscle, and that will allow you to have a delay, also a much more longer lasting contraction. The delay also takes place because it takes some time to generate the bonus gator calcium channels, and the whole process is longer. But skeletal muscle by far the fastest, and the smooth muscle, as you can see here, is by far the longest lasting. At the same time, it generates the most force. The way you can see that also is, so the integral, here it's very large, so it takes for a long period of time, so it's sustained force, which you need that. If you're going to have your muscles for different organs, you really don't have the sustained contractions. You really don't have quick contractions. I took this table from your physiology book. It has a good summary of the different elements. And as I point out, some of the things that I talked about, and one of the main things is also this. So the smooth muscle, besides different agents, different hormones can really activate it, so you can engage it without having to have any electrical stimulus, but also you can apply different hormones who will change they will activate enzyme inside the smooth muscle that allow it to contract. They will engage the muscle that's in kinase in different ways. Because there's phosphorylation events, you can actually initiate kinases that can go and phosphorylate different components of the process, so you can really control smooth muscle in multiple different ways. Where in the case of skeletal muscle, you require to have requires acetylcholine. So you always need acetylcholine to get the skeletal muscle to activate and contract. So we'll move on some examples of different disorders that and how we try to treat them and how to try to engage them, and talk about some of the other general properties about muscle in general. So I'll focus on two of them, dystonia and malignant hypothermia. So one thing before I go on is about the property of the whole muscle, is that if you remember, each motor unit, which is one nerve and all the fibers it connects, is what activates at the same time. So if you want to have a very large contraction, you need to activate multiple motor units. The more motor units you activate, the greater number of cells you activate, the greater of the force the whole muscle will create. However, there is also what's called a muscle tone, and that is a continuous steady activation. We're always having, the muscles are not completely non-contractile. They're always going to have some stimulation, there's always going to be a little bit contracted. And that allows them to go to tune, either they can change, so that way allows more flexibility. You can actually, it's like a tuning part. If you have some tone, if you need more, you activate more. If you need less, you stop the input. So it allows flexibility to the system. But muscle tone is something you always have. However, for some cases, this muscle tone becomes too much. I'll mention this one, blepharospasm, which in this case is our muscles for the eyelids that constantly contract. But the major disorder that this belongs to is called dystonia, and it's characterized by voluntary sustained muscle activation. In their cases, they have this constant activation of the muscles. A lot of times, this happens from central nervous system, so the signal is constantly sent. And what's happening in dystonia is you have multiple different muscle groups that are now being activated in a time they shouldn't be. So it's not having, let's say, your bicep and your tricep activated separately, they may try to be active at the same time. As a result, you see patients have a wobbling stature. I'll give you examples. But let me talk about a little bit about this one. So this is an example of that. It's a silent movement. It's actually quite old. That's interesting. can imagine if you cannot see, your gait cannot be good. So how many think psychotherapy is the way for this? So back then, that was the main idea, is if you talk to somebody, you'll be able to maybe figure out a way out of his problems. The case of this, he's pretty unique in which when he opens his mouth, his eyes open. That's not typical. He has other issues with his wiring. However, what I want to bring out is because in dystonia, this is what you see. You have this completely loss in the voluntary ability to control your muscles. Instead, now they're constantly active. So the question is, how can you treat that? And there are a couple of ways. One of them is by knowing the way you're going to treat something like that is you're going to find a long-term solution. And when you look at neuromuscular junction, one way to do this long-term solution is to shut down transmission. So if you're going to have, in order to have contraction, you need to have vesicles binding to the membrane and fusing. So if you find a drug that stops that, you'll be able to stop these involuntary contractions. And the way this is done is actually by Botox. So Botox is heavily used. Most of you know Botox from cosmetic surgery, so it came from there. But that came later. It became popular after people use it to treat dystonias. And they realized when they do that, in the case of space, not only they're getting stop of these dystonias, they're getting this really nice skin. So cosmetic surgery, that's great. Let me take advantage of it. But in reality, that's what it really is for. So what botulinum toxin does is the following. Botulinum toxin can enter the synaptic terminal, so it actually gets inside. When it goes inside, it actually binds to proteins around the vesicles, preventing them from binding to the terminal. So what you have now is a complete loss of transmission. That actually creates some atrophy for quite some time. But what's happening is this is not a permanent fix. Every few months, people have to go and get another round of Botox. The reason being is eventually botulinum will clear up from the system, and then you're going to start having transmission, and the symptoms come up. So most of the time, you can use these type of things primarily for localized. But if somebody has a complete body dystonia, you cannot go and inject them throughout the body. It's not going to be able to work out. But for smaller places like your eyes and so forth. Now, over the years, unfortunately, some people decided to do it themselves. So actually, when you look in the news, you will find, I think there was one case for somebody who decided to access Botox herself and have a friend to inject it. And as a result, they paralyzed half their face. What's happening is if you don't do localized, you're going to start spreading. So you need to be very localized in order to do it. Otherwise, it's going to spill out to different muscles, and instead of getting this nice skin, you're going to get complete paralysis of your skin, which is really not something, but it's not permanent. That's the key. You can eventually, it will go away and eventually comes back to it. Another example of how the dystonias, in this case, the central nervous system. And there's a new technology for that, which is fairly I would say it's new. It's becoming more and more popular, and that's called deep brain stimulation. It's about 5 minutes.
You're about to witness a miracle.
So you can see that if you have these dystonias, you have all these complete involuntary movements.
That stops the shake. Ends all the misery. You can smile.
Yes, I can smile now.
From this, amazingly, to this.
It's a sunny day in Cleveland.
It's called deep brain stimulation.
It was the final stab in the demon that possessed this wretched body for so long.
And it's transforming lives completely.
It's a wonderful world to be in. I love this place.
Hey, how are you there?
This is Graham's last resort.
Now, how bad's the tremor in your right hand? Can you show us there for us? We'll do the left side of the brain first, because that controls the right hand, okay?
Delicate and dangerous surgery
Tell me whether you can feel anything, Graham.
in which surgeon Richard Bitar bores 2 holes into Graham's skull to target the tiny pocket of cells causing the tremor.
Not hurting too much?
No, very heavy.
There's a 10% chance of either stroke or paralysis, even death.
Had he no shoes there?
And incredibly, Graham is awake for every second of it.
And how are you feeling there, Graham?
The reason being is your brain doesn't have pain receptors, so you don't feel pain in your brain. There are no receptors that induce pain.
Deep brain stimulation is a new frontier in medicine, offering huge potential to people with neurological disorders. And this is the key. A tiny electrode. Using this, doctors can pinpoint the exact part of the brain that's on the blink. It's been successful with Parkinson's disease, but for millions of people suffering from other movement disorders, trapped in a body they can't control, deep brain stimulation could one day set them free.
This is how it works. 2 electrodes were inserted into the part of Jeff's brain causing his Tourette's. They are connected to a battery in the chest. It's like a pacemaker for the brain. The electrical pulses neutralise the faulty brain signal, but they must be in exactly the right place. Back in Melbourne's Alfred Hospital, Graham Miller is hoping for his own miracle.
I think what staggers me is Graham is awake in the theatre in this brace, and he'll be working with you, won't he?
He's a critical part of this whole process.
So it could be like, yes, that's the right spot, that's the right spot.
Yeah, he'll know. He'll know. If we hit the right spot, he should be able to tell us. And how are you feeling there, Graham?
As it has for the last 10 years, Graham's hand has been shaking throughout the surgery.
We know that we're in the right area, and we want to make sure that we get the best spot so that we can put the wire in that position.
But now the moment has come. Dr. Bitar has located the trouble spot and is about to hit it with an electric current.
Is it stationary now?
Yes, that's right. It's never stopped.
Good.
You can tell the difference, can't you, Graham?
Certainly can.
Yeah.
Back in Melbourne, battered and bruised, Graham Miller is recovering from more than 6 hours in surgery.
Oh, Richard, it'll be good. Yes, it'll be very good. How do you feel?
Graham now has electrodes in his brain and the pacemaker in his chest. It worked on the operating table. Will it work now? Using a simple remote control, his pacemaker is switched on for the first time.
That's us turning it up. Can you feel that? See how the tremor goes? Okay, now take a sip. Good.
Graham, what's it like to be still?
Well, it's amazing, really.
When I first met you, you'd hold your glass like...
So deep brain stimulation was, which by far is becoming more and more popular. So the way this works is that you have brain region called basal ganglia that it's part of the initiation of movements, and what's happening there sometimes seems to be going to this loop, and you cannot get out of it, so you lose the control of it. So what the idea is, by giving an electrical stimulation, you pretty much untangle it and let it, and then you can have control for it again. They mentioned it that it was first developed for Parkinson. That was the first. If you have Parkinson and nothing else worked, deep brain stimulation is something to do. But since then, they're expanding it. Dystonia is the next expansion, and it has pretty dramatic effects. So if you have a full body dystonia, that is the only reason the only way to treat it, because you can't, as I mentioned, Botox plug body. We need to find something else to do it. This technology is also trying to be used now for depression. It hasn't been approved yet, but there are movements trying to get it for depression or even epilepsy. The limitation of this technology is called open loop. And open loop means you have to constantly apply electrical current independent. So you have to always stimulate with certain frequency. And there haven't been very long-term studies, but in some cases, particularly with Parkinson, eventually you desensitize, but in this case it might be because they're losing the nerves. So here, if everything is intact, theoretically this could be sustained, and so forth. But anyhow, that would be another way to control dystonias is by controlling centrally. So by trying to identify a central locus that is defective, then allows to affect the body. On the local, when you have small dystonias, like the one with the eyelids, you can actually use Botox. Now, there's another disorder called malignant hypothermia, and this hasn't received much prominence, but it happens more often than one expects. And what malignant hypothermia is pretty much if you go to have surgery and they give you an anesthetic, primarily a volatile anesthetic, either halothane or sevoflurane or rasiflurane, in some cases you're going to get rigor, your temperature is going to skyrocket to 1 degree Celsius per 5 minutes. So you're reaching 46 degrees extremely fast. And if that happens, you can die. Similarly, it's not just volatile anesthetics that do that. It can also happen with acetylcholine, which I mentioned as a depolarizing blocker. So what's happening here is the following. For some of us, arachidonic receptors, the ones who are actually required to open in the calcium column, they have POM mutations, which they don't really seem to affect them in their day-to-day function. But in the presence of certain drugs, they seem to respond too robustly. They become extremely active. So now what you have is, what you see here, here's the diagram of the receptors, and all these box and squares are POM mutations people have identified over the years. But what's happening in this case is that this receptor becomes overly active, dumping a lot of calcium. And the reason why dumping a lot of calcium is a problem is, as I mentioned, because of this. You're getting way too much overload of calcium. As a result, you're going to be in constant cross-bridging, so you're constantly going to be contracting. At the same time, all this calcium load will activate the pumps. The pumps will try to remove it, even though you're still getting more. That breaks down, that makes ATP to go to ATP, releasing heat. You're releasing heat now because of the contraction. Also, calcium will activate oxidate phosphorylation, you're making more ATP. So pretty much what you have is you have this massive generation of ATP and breaking down, generating all this heat and rigor at the same time. So, and that's the reason why the heat goes up, because now the muscle is in this constant overload and then it generates a lot of heat. And having too much heat is not good. It's going to really shut down the person. I think in Connecticut about 4 years ago, there was a case of a patient who went to for outpatient clinic and she ended up dying because of this. And nowadays it's required for all the clinics to have a drug called dantrolene. Dantrolene binds to randomly receptors and it shuts them down. So the idea is here, if somebody does enter to malignant hypothermia, you give him an inhibitor, a blocker for those random receptors, and as a result, you shut down the calcium coming in, allowing the pumps to just primarily remove the calcium, causing relaxation, and then as a result, cooling the patient. And of course, they also put the patient into that. So the point I want to make is that the balance here is quite delicate. So if you're not having any pure defects in around the receptors, having too much calcium, or if you have some going on with your pumps, you can build up enough calcium that you're going to have quite a bit of side effects, not just simply contractions, but also the heat generated. So let me move now to more about main problems of muscle force and tension and the mechanics for them. So what causes the force? What is the optimal thing for the force? We keep talking about the actin muscle cycle, but the way the thick and the thin filaments are overlapped are optimal to generate the greatest number of force. So what you see here is the tension you can create. It's the most tension you can create. And then what type of overlap you need to have to start in order to get that force. And what you can see here is that if you start with a complete overlap, you will never create any force because there is no movement for the thin and the active filaments to slide against each other to contract the cyclones. You're already into that state. So, and then as you further move them apart, you're finding out that there is this optimal distance of 2 to 2.3 micrometers. So you need to have about some overlap, not complete. You need to have some overlap in order to create the maximum force. If you have almost no overlap, you will never create the force. And that's kind of logical because if there's no overlap, you're not going to be able to create cross bridges. If you have very little overlap, you're still fairly far away, so you cannot generate enough cross bridges to drive the whole sarcomere to contract. So there is an optimal force. So there's an optimal overlap in order to get the maximum force. So this is very much controlled by everything. And it requires a lot of components in order to develop this type of overlap. I mentioned that you have a muscle twitch, which is a single contraction relaxation cycle. And also, I will highlight there is also delays. So first you get the axial potential. Then you're going to get an axial potential in the muscle, in this case skeletal muscle. But it's going to be delayed a little bit because it takes some time for acetylcholine to bind to the membrane, to the vesicles containing acetylcholine to fuse, and then acetylcholine to be released, diffuse, and then active. And then there is a lot of delay because now you have multiple steps. Now you need to get calcium into the system, the calcium in the skeletal muscle. Troponin, myosin has to move away and create a cycle. But as soon as you start that cycle and then relax it, that's going to be your muscle twitch. That's for one. But if you want to have a continuous contractions for the muscle, in order to really create the force, you need to start contracting multiple times. And the way you do that is by having a summation of contractions. So here you see one muscle twitch. Now if you send another signal very soon after that, you're going to build on that. So now the contractions summate. As the contractions summate, you start developing the maximum force you could possibly generate. And that, you can see that here. As you keep stimulating, and as a result, you're stimulating again before there is a relaxation of the first muscle twist, you start adding a summation. And that allows you to have the maximum tension, the maximum force that the muscle can generate. Now in this case, it's called unfused tension. However, if you keep doing this, you end up with what's called tetanus. And you can see here, after that, you still can see some events here clearly, but then when you reach the tetanus, you have this complete plateau phase, and you're at the maximum tension. Now there's one distinction between tetanus and a typical muscle twitch, is the relaxation phase. In the case of the twitch, relaxation takes place by simply having calcium be removed, and then you stop with the contractions. In the case of tetanus, you can still stimulate, but eventually you're going to relax because of fatigue. The muscle now is going to be fatigued, you're going to exhaust its energy sources. As a result, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's one mechanism of fatigue. So the main thing I want to get out of it is that muscle fatigue or stroke stimulation keeps the muscle in a state of tetanus. So if you constantly activate the muscle, you really reach a collapse of the muscle and it gets fatigued. After rest, the muscle can start doing it, but you can take, depending on the tetanus, depending on what type of stimulation, It can take anywhere from a few minutes, days, or takes depending on what you've done. Now, fatigue also can be generated from other sources. And on the molecular level, it could simply be you have reduction of calcium release. You may have the calcium troponin interaction is not working very well. You may have depletion of energy sources. However, as you go, you can have neurotransmitter release. So you have a finite number of vesicles in the neuromuscular junction. So if you constantly stimulate it, you can deplete those. So as a result, that will also lead to fatigue. And then you have central nervous system. Some cases it could be psychological. You can have some kind of psychological effect which doesn't give enough stimulation to lead to the contractions. So there are multiple components of getting fatigue, but the major ones are primarily exhaustion of the energy sources and depletion of the neurotransmitter. So I will finish up with the whole cell mechanics, very briefly. So when you're looking, before I go to that, let me highlight the following. Exercise is critical for muscles. If there's no exercise, you get muscle atrophy. However, if you do exercise, you get the muscle hypertrophy. In this case, when we talk about hypertrophy, it's not that you add new muscle fibers, you're not adding new muscle cells. Instead, you start building up more mitochondria, and your myofilaments and fibroblasts increase in number. So by increasing those in number, now you are increasing the elements of contractile. So you have more things to contract. As a result, you create more force. You know, if you're going to get more cells, you're going to have a hyperplasia, which in these cases, you add more cells into the existing skeletal muscle. There are some evidence that steroid use actually does that as well, allows for more muscles to fuse together and allowing for creating a much bigger muscle. Now, our bodies really controls how much muscle we're going to have in development. And there is a protein called myostatin, in which if it is defective, you get extreme muscle growth. So what you see here is a couple of animals in which they don't have this protein that cells development stop making more muscle. This is actually a case of the two mice. This is a wild-type mouse, so it's a regular mouse, and this is a mouse in which they have removed the gene that makes myostatin. And when you do that, you can clearly see this is the same age-matched littermate. So those two mice were grown at with the same food sources, and at the same cage, you can see getting quite a bit of a size difference. The same goes for some bulls, and this is the whippet, the bully whippet, I think it's called the name of the dog. You can clearly see this builds a huge muscle. Having that much muscle is actually not a good thing. It actually is detrimental to the health of the animal. This is part of the reason of this control. The last few years, people have identified humans who have it, and there are few examples of humans in which they have defective myostatin, and as a result, they build up a lot more muscle, and they're much stronger. But there are very few, it's a very rare case. Over the years, people try to think if they can use myostatin for making bigger cows, making bigger bulls. However, the cost of maintaining those